She stepped off that stagecoach with her chin up and her heart hammering, and the very first sound she heard in Dust Creek was laughter. Not the warm kind. The cruel kind, the kind that wraps around your throat and squeezes. A man hollered something ugly about her size, and the whole street erupted. Abigail Harper did not cry. She did not run. She simply lifted her carpet bag and kept walking. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear. If that kind of story speaks to your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rolled into Dust Creek just past noon on a Thursday in the summer of 1887, and the heat was the kind that made men mean and dogs lazy, and the whole world feel like it was one bad word away from catching fire. Abigail Harper was the last one off. She had to turn sideways to get through the door, and she knew it, and she did it anyway with her spine straight and her carpet bag gripped in both hands and her brown eyes already scanning the street, the way a woman scans any new place when she doesn't know yet if it's safe. It wasn't. The laughter started before her second foot hit the ground. Lord Almighty! A man in a dirty work shirt leaned against the post outside the general store, arms crossed, grinning wide. That the bride they sent up for Caleb Walker. His friend beside him spit tobacco juice into the dirt. Looks like they sent him two brides in one. A woman on the far end of the porch pressed her hand over her mouth. Not in horror, Abigail noticed. In amusement. A child pointed. Another man whistled low, the mocking kind, and said something to the man beside him that made them both buckle over. Abigail stood in the middle of it all and did not move. Her face went hot. The kind of hot that starts behind the eyes and spreads down the neck and sits in the chest like a coal. 29 years of living in this body had given her plenty of practice at standing inside that particular fire. She'd learned not to show it. She'd learned to keep her jaw loose, and her shoulders back, and her eyes forward, even when every instinct she had was screaming at her to fold. She did not fold. "You lookin' for the Walker Ranch?" A boy of about 12, freckled and gap-toothed, had appeared at her elbow. He at least had the decency to look at her face when he asked. "I am," she said. "He ain't here." The boy jerked his thumb toward the far end of town. "Sent his ranch hand Hector. That's him over by the livery." She looked. A compact, sun-darkened man in his 40s was watching her from beside two horses, his hat in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Not laughing. Not joining in. That was enough for her. She walked toward him with the laughter still going on behind her back. "Miss Harper," Hector said when she reached him. "That's me." He looked at her. Just a quick, honest assessment. Nothing cruel in it. And then he nodded once and reached for her bag. "I'll take that, ma'am. We got a ride ahead of us." "How far?" 3 hours up the mesa. Maybe more if the trail's dried out bad." He secured her bag to the second horse and then looked at her again, something careful in his expression now. "Mr. Walker, he told me to tell you something, ma'am, before you made the trip." "All right." Hector turned his hat in his hands once, twice. "He said to tell you the ranch is hard work. No luxuries. The last 3 women, they didn't stay." He paused. "He said if you're expecting something soft, you ought to know now that it ain't gonna be soft." Abigail looked at the horse, then at the trail beyond town that wound up into the raw red rocks of Red Mesa, baking under that white summer sky. "Tell me something, Hector," she said. "Ma'am, did those 3 women leave because the ranch was hard?" She picked up her riding gloves from her coat pocket and began pulling them on one finger at a time. "Or did they leave because the man was—" Hector was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough. "Might have been some of both, ma'am." "Well." She put her foot in the stirrup. "At least you're honest." The trail up Red Mesa was brutal. The sun hammered down on rock and scrub brush and dust, and the heat rose off the ground in visible waves that made everything ahead look like it was melting. Her horse, a steady roan mare. Clara picked her way along the narrow path with patience and sureness, and Abigail matched her, staying quiet, staying still, not fighting the animal's rhythm. Hector glanced back at her a few times in the first hour. Each time she was still in the saddle, still upright, not complaining. By the second hour he'd stopped looking back. She noticed that too. The ranch appeared around a bend in the trail, like something that had always been there, and always would be stubborn and weather-beaten and utterly unmovable. A main house with a wide porch. A barn that had seen better decades. 3 outbuildings in varying states of repair. Fencing that stretched out toward the mesa's edge, and then gave up somewhere in the heat shimmer. And standing at the edge of the porch, arms crossed watching her ride in, was Caleb Walker. She'd been given no description of him. The matchmaker's letter had said 35 single hard-working owns land. It had not said tall. It had not said broad through the shoulder in a way that made him look like he'd been built for exactly this landscape. It had not said that his face under the shadow of his hat brim was the kind of face that had lived hard in the sun and showed every year of it, and that somehow that made him more rather than less. It also had not said that the first thing he would do when she dismounted was look her up and down with an expression that was not cruelty. It was something worse. Resignation. Like he'd already decided how this would end. "Miss Harper," he said. His voice was low and flat and carried no welcome in it. "Mr. Walker." She stood her ground at the base of the porch steps, her bag at her feet looking up at him. He came down one step, stopped. "You know what you're getting into here. I know what the letter said." The letter didn't say the well's running low, didn't say 3 of the 4 fence lines need replacing, didn't say we've already lost 6 head of cattle this summer and probably gonna lose more. He tilted his head. Didn't say the last woman lasted 8 days before she said she'd rather starve in the city than spend one more night on this mountain. Is that meant to scare me off? It's meant to save us both some time. She met his eyes. They were gray, the particular gray of storm clouds. Before the rain breaks, unsettled and watchful and tired. 3 women left, she said. I heard, and you've decided I'll be the 4th. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Mr. Walker." She picked up her bag. "Point me to where I'll be sleeping. I'd like to change out of this dress and find out what needs doing before sundown." He stared at her for a moment that stretched out long enough to have a sound. Then he stepped aside and opened the door. She was up before dawn. Caleb didn't know that at first. He'd woken at 4:30 the way he always did, already dressed before he was fully conscious, moving through the dark house by memory. He'd come out to the porch expecting silence and found a lantern already burning in the chicken coop. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked over and pushed the coop door open. Abigail was crouched in the straw, her good dress swapped for a plain work skirt and blouse, her hair pinned back, her sleeves pushed up, and she was speaking quietly to a hen that had gotten herself wedged under the nesting shelf. The hen was not cooperative. Abigail was patient. "Little bit to the left, sweetheart," she murmured. "There you go, there you go." Caleb watched her work the hen loose without panicking the bird or startling the others, and then watched her stand up and brush the straw off her skirt and reach for the feed bucket all in one unhurried motion. She turned and found him in the doorway. Neither of them spoke. "Eggs are laid," she said after a moment. "I'll get the grain started for the horses, unless you want me on something else first." He was quiet long enough that she started to move past him. "Miss Harper?" She stopped. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." He didn't have a response for that. She went past him toward the barn. The first week was a cold thing. Caleb spoke to her in instructions, in logistics. He told her what time meals needed to be ready, which animals needed feeding in what order, where the water could and couldn't be wasted. He did not ask about her life before, did not volunteer anything about his own. He worked beside her for hours without saying a word, and when something needed doing, that was too heavy for her alone. Moving a fence post, hauling feed sacks, he did it without comment or offer, just appeared beside her and did it. She accepted that. Didn't try to force conversation, didn't fill the quiet with chatter. But she watched him. She watched the way he checked the water level in the storage tank every morning, the way his jaw tightened when it was lower than he'd hoped. She watched the way he looked west in the evenings, toward the land that belonged to Silas Boone. Something careful and guarded in his expression, like a man keeping score of something he wasn't ready to talk about yet. She watched the way he ran his hand down the neck of his horse every morning. Before he saddled him, the gesture entirely unconscious, entirely tender. He was not a cruel man. That was the first thing she'd learned. He was a man who had been hurt in the specific way that makes a person build walls so fast and so high that they forget there was ever a door. She'd known men like that. She'd known women like that too. She was something like that herself. On the 9th day, Hector came riding up to the ranch at a pace that meant bad news. "Fire," he said before he'd fully stopped. "East slope. Winds pushing it toward the lower pasture." The lower pasture was where the cattle were. Caleb was already moving for his horse. "How far out?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Caleb looked at Abigail. And in that look she saw it clearly. He expected her to stay at the house. To wait. To be the kind of woman who was kept out of the dangerous parts. She was already untying her horse. "Miss Harper." "I can ride," she said. "And you need hands." He looked at her for 1 second longer. "Stay behind me on the trail." Fine. She didn't stay behind him on the trail. The fire was moving the way. Summer fires on Red Mesa moved fast and greedy and without any interest in mercy. The smoke was visible half a mile out, a thick brown column that flattened at the top and then spread, and the smell of it hit them before they could see the flames. She'd never driven cattle before, not once, but she'd watched Caleb work the herd twice that first week, had stood at the fence and studied the way he and Hector moved around the animals, where you pushed from how wide you spread the sounds you made. She'd filed it away, the way she filed everything away quietly and completely. She split off from Caleb without being told, taking the far flank of the herd, moving Clara in a wide arc to push the cattle away from the smoke rather than through it. She shouted, she slapped leather on her saddle, she kept her line tight. Clara was steady. The cattle were terrified, but she gave them somewhere to go, and they went. The fire crested the ridge and exhaled a wall of heat, and Abigail pushed through it closer than she should have, because there were 3 calves who'd gotten separated and were frozen in panic at the base of a burning scrub line. She got them out. When it was over, when the herd was in the upper field, and Hector was counting heads, and the fire was burning itself out against the bare rock, it had no choice but to hit. She slid off Clara, and found that her right forearm was red and tight, and beginning to blister along a 4-inch line, where the heat had caught her without her realizing it. She was examining it when Caleb walked up. He grabbed her wrist, gently, more gently than she'd expected, and turned her arm to look at it. His face was still, smoke-stained. His eyes moved over the burn, and then up to her face. "You went in after those calves," he said. "Someone had to. I was coming back for them. I was already there." He held her wrist for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he released it carefully, and pulled a strip of clean cloth from his saddlebag. He always rode with it, she'd noticed, and began wrapping the burn with the efficient, practiced hands of a man who'd doctored his own wounds alone for years. She let him. "That was reckless," he said, wrapping. "Yes." "You could have been hurt worse." "Yes." "Don't do it again." She watched him tie off the bandage. His hands were very steady. She thought about what Hector had told her, nothing specific, just the shape of it, the outline. A man who didn't trust. A man who'd built his whole life up here on this mesa alone, because the other option was too costly. "Were you going to come back for those calves?" she asked. He looked up. "If it had been just you and Hector today," she said, "would you have gone back in for them?" A long pause. The wind moved between them, carrying smoke. "Yes," he said. "Then we're not so different." He stood up. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived, not assessing or measuring or calculating. How long before she quit? Just looked at her, the way you look at something that surprised you. He opened his mouth, closed it, put his hat back on. "We ride back before the trail gets dark," he said, and walked to his horse. But he rode slower on the way home, stayed close. She noticed. At the edge of the upper pasture before they reached the trail, she spotted them. 3 riders sitting still on the ridgeline, looking down at the ranch. Not Dust Creek men, she didn't know their faces. But she knew the type. The way a man sits a horse when he's not there to work. When he's there to look. When someone has sent him to count your losses and report back. "Who are those men?" she asked quietly. Caleb's eyes had already found them. His jaw was set in a line she was beginning to recognize. "They ride for Silas Boone," he said, "the landowner. He owns the land east and west and south of this ranch." Caleb's voice was even. Careful, the way a man speaks when he's keeping something very controlled. "Only thing he doesn't own is the water source up on the north face. That feeds every property on this mesa, including his." A pause. "He wants it." She looked at the riders. They looked back. Then one of them wheeled his horse, and they rode down the far side of the ridge and disappeared. "How long has he been pushing?" she asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Long enough." She turned to look at him. The sun was getting low, turning the mesa the color of a banked fire, and in that light, Caleb Walker looked like a man holding something very heavy who had been holding it alone for a very long time. "We should get back," he said. She didn't argue. But that night after supper, after Caleb had gone out to check the fences, and she was alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low, she sat at the table, and she thought about everything she'd seen in 9 days on this mountain. The shrinking water tank, the cattle, the fire, the riders on the ridge, the man who had wrapped her burn with careful hands and then walked away before she could see his face change. She'd come to Red Mesa with nothing but a carpet bag and the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd been told her whole life that she was less, that she was too much and not enough at the same time, that her body was a problem to be managed rather than a self to be respected. She hadn't come here to be saved. She hadn't come here to save anyone. She'd come here for a chance, and whatever was coming, and something was coming, she could feel it the way you feel. Whether before it shows, she was not going to run from it. She'd promised herself that on the stagecoach with the dust of 100 miles behind her and the laughter of Dust Creek still ringing in her ears. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. She was up before dawn. The morning after the fire, Abigail woke up and her arm hurt worse than it had the night before. She didn't say anything about it. She wrapped it herself in the kitchen before anyone else was up, pulling the cloth tight with her teeth, when she ran out of hands, and then she went out and started the grain. That was how the second week began. Caleb noticed the way she held the bucket favoring the right side, shifting the weight to her left, and he didn't say anything either. But at breakfast, he set a small tin of salve beside her coffee cup without comment and went back to eating. She looked at the tin, looked at him. He was reading a worn piece of paper, a water survey she'd learn later, and did not look up. She used the salve. It helped. That small thing, the tin, the silence around it, the fact that he'd gone to the trouble without making it a conversation, sat in her chest for the rest of the day, in a way she didn't fully examine. She was practical by nature. She dealt in what was in front of her. But she was also honest with herself, always had been, and she was honest enough to admit that she was paying attention to Caleb Walker in a way that had nothing to do with practicality. She just didn't know yet what to do with that. The town did not make it easier. She'd ridden down to Dust Creek with Hector on the 12th day to pick up supplies because Caleb had a fence line to finish and couldn't leave. She had a list in her coat pocket and exact change in her purse, and she walked into Morrison's general store like a woman who had every right to be there because she did. The woman behind the counter was named Ruth Morrison, wife of the owner, and she had the particular smile of a person who has been storing up something to say. "Well," Ruth said, "you're still here." "I am," Abigail said. She set her list on the counter. Ruth looked at the list, then at Abigail. "We had a pool going, you know, in town, on how long you'd last." Abigail said nothing. Most people said 2 weeks. Ruth's smile sharpened. Harold Briggs said 3 days. He owes Frank Delaney $1 now, I suppose. "I'll need 20 pounds of flour," Abigail said, "and whatever you've got in dried beans." Ruth didn't move to fill the order. "Honey, I'm not saying it mean. I'm saying it honest. 3 women left that man. Smart women, some of them. Pretty women. And Caleb Walker didn't chase a single one." She leaned on the counter, lowered her voice to something that wanted to sound like concern. A man who doesn't chase you when you leave is a man who was never really holding on to begin with. Abigail looked up from the list. Mrs. Morrison, she said quietly, I didn't come here to be chased. I came here to work. Now are you going to fill this order, or am I going to take my money to the next town? A beat. Ruth's smile tightened. Then she pulled the list off the counter and turned toward the shelves. Hector was waiting outside with the wagon. When Abigail came out with the first load, he took it from her without asking and loaded it himself, and when she came back with the second, he did the same. On the third trip, he just walked in with her and carried it himself and said nothing about what he'd heard through the window. She appreciated that more than she could say. On the ride back up the mesa, Hector was quiet for a while. Then he said, Ruth Morrison's been mean since 1882. Don't let her take up space in your head. She's not, Abigail said. He glanced at her. Okay. She stopped. Started again. Is it true that he didn't try to stop any of them from leaving? Hector was quiet long enough that the answer shaped itself in the silence. He didn't stop them, he said finally. But I don't think he didn't care. He adjusted his grip on the reins. I think he cared and didn't know how to say it, and by the time he figured out how to say it, they were already gone. A pause. Caleb Walker is a man who does. He's not much of a man who says. She thought about the tin of salve, the careful wrapping of her burn, the way he'd slowed his horse on the way home from the fire. I know the type, she said. He's a good man, Hector said. Got some hard places in him, but good underneath. I know that too, she said. They didn't talk the rest of the way up. She was quiet through dinner that evening. Not unhappy quiet, thinking quiet. Caleb watched her. He always watched things he hadn't figured out yet from a sideways angle, careful and patient as a man reading weather. Finally he said, Morrison give you trouble. She looked up. What makes you think that? Ruth Morrison gives every woman trouble. He pushed beans around his plate. She gave the last 3 trouble too. First one cried all the way home. Second one came back and told me I ought to be ashamed of myself for having a connection to that town at all. Something moved in his face. Not quite amusement. Not quite pain. Third one just got quieter and quieter until one morning she was gone. Abigail watched him. Which bothered you most? He stopped pushing the beans. Looked at her directly, which he didn't do often. The one who got quiet, he said. Because by the time she left, I didn't know her well enough to have tried to keep her. The kitchen was very still. Well, Abigail said. I'm not quiet. No, he agreed. You're not. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not large, not dramatic. Just a small thing turning over to show its other side. She went back to her plate. He went back to his. But the kitchen felt different afterward, less like a place where 2 strangers happened to be eating, and more like a place that was starting to belong to both of them. She noticed. She thought he did too. The second twist came 3 days later, and it came from the water. Caleb had been checking the storage tank every morning since she'd arrived. She knew because she'd started checking it too, before he did, wanting to have the number in her head before breakfast. The level had been dropping slowly at first, the way things drop when you're watching them and hoping you're wrong. Then faster. That morning it was bad. Not empty. Not yet. But bad enough that she stood there in the early gray light, looking at the waterline, and did the math in her head, and didn't like what she came up with. She was still standing there when Caleb walked up. He looked at the tank. He didn't speak for a long time. How long? She asked. At this rate. His voice was level in the way that meant he was working to keep it that way. 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if we cut the herd's water and the horses don't suffer for it. And the source on the north face. He looked at her. Should still be running. It feeds down through the rock and into this tank. The problem isn't the source. He stopped. What is the problem? Another pause. The kind that has something hard sitting inside it. 2 weeks ago I found the intake channel partially blocked. Rocks and silt. I cleared it. Yesterday Hector found it blocked again. She turned to look at him fully. Blocked how? Same way. Rocks. Silt. His jaw was tight. The kind that doesn't move itself. Boone's men, she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She thought about the riders on the ridge watching the fire, watching the cattle run, counting losses from a safe distance. He's trying to dry you out, she said. He's been trying to dry me out for 2 years. Caleb's voice was quiet and flat, and absolutely without self-pity, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been angry. He wants this land, Miss Harper, the water rights that come with it. He can't get them legally as long as I hold the deed. But if the ranch fails, he stopped. If the ranch fails, you'll sell. Or abandon. He looked at the tank again. He's patient, I'll give him that. She stood beside him in the gray morning air and thought about a man who could watch another man's livestock die from thirst and call it a strategy. The anger that moved through her was clean and cold and clarifying. Show me the intake channel, she said. It's a hard ride up the north face, 3 hours. Show me, she said again. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went to saddle the horses. The ride up the north face was exactly as hard as he'd said. The trail was narrow and exposed, and the summer heat bounced off the rock in waves, and Clara had to pick her way carefully through stretches where the path was barely wider than the horse herself. Abigail stayed in the saddle. Didn't ask to stop. Didn't complain about the heat or the pitch of the trail, or the way her knees ached from gripping. When they reached the intake channel, she saw it immediately. It wasn't silt. Not naturally anyway. Someone had packed it deliberately, rocks wedged tight with smaller gravel pushed in around them. The whole thing positioned at a point in the channel where the water pressure wasn't strong enough to shift it. It was careful work. Patient work. The work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This was done by someone who's been up here before, she said. Caleb crouched beside the blockage looking at it. Yeah, more than once. She pointed to an older silt line on the rock beside the channel, the ghost of a previous block that had been cleared. That's the one you cleared 2 weeks ago. This one's newer. Different technique, see how they've wedged the anchor stone. The first one probably shifted too fast. They learned. He looked at her. My father was a miller, she said. I grew up knowing water, how it moves, how it stops. She looked in at the channel, then up the slope toward where the source spring emerged from the rock. If they block it here again, they'll try further up next time, closer to the source. I know. We need to do something about the channel itself, not just keep clearing it. Build the inlet wider, increase the pressure, make it harder to dam. She paused. And we need to know who's doing it. The riders on the ridge could report back to Boone. But this, she gestured at the careful technical blockage. This isn't a hired ranch hand throwing rocks. Someone up here knows what they're doing. Caleb was very still looking at her. What? She said. Nothing. He looked back at the channel. You're right, about all of it. He started clearing the blockage, pulling the anchor stone free with both hands. There's a man in town, name of Garrett. Used to work for the Territorial Water Board before Boone hired him away. So Boone has someone who knows water law and water engineering. And enough money to use both however he wants. She started helping clear the gravel. They worked side by side in the heat, neither speaking, and when the channel was clear and running again, and they stood up and watched the water find its level, she felt something that had nothing to do with the work itself. A rightness about standing beside this man on this mountain doing this particular necessary thing. She pushed it aside. There was more to deal with. Coming down the north face. Caleb stopped his horse on a wide flat rock that gave a view down across the whole mesa, his land, Boone's land east and west, the distant smear of Dust Creek to the south. He sat there looking at it for a moment. Then he said, I had a woman before, not a mail-order bride. Someone I knew. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying so long it's developed its own weight and shape. 6 years ago. We were going to be married in the spring. Abigail said nothing. Waited. Flash flood, March thaw. She was crossing Cutler Creek on the way to her sister's ranch. A pause that had a whole geography in it. The water came down the canyon faster than anyone expected. They found her horse 2 miles downstream. The mesa wind moved between them. Caleb, she said quietly, I built this ranch after, he said. Moved up here. Told myself I was better off alone. That the mountain didn't ask things of you that you couldn't give. His voice was steady and completely honest, in the way of someone who had long since stopped being angry about a thing, and was simply reporting its shape. The women the agency sent, I think part of me was hoping they'd leave, so I wouldn't have to. She let that settle. And now, she asked. He looked out at the Mesa for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He didn't answer. But the not answering was different from the not answering that had come before. Less like a wall. More like a door that hadn't been opened in a very long time, sitting slightly ajar, letting in air. He clicked his horse forward. She followed. That evening, Hector came to dinner, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Abigail watched the two men talk. Really talk. Not the logistics and weather talk she'd heard before, but the particular language of people who had worked alongside each other through hard seasons and built something like trust out of it. Hector made Caleb laugh once, a short, surprised sound, and Caleb looked almost startled by it, like he'd forgotten that was something his face could do. She filed that away too. After dinner, while Caleb was out checking the horses, Hector lingered at the table with his coffee. He told you something today, Hector said. It wasn't a question. A little, she said. About Elena. She nodded. Hector turned his cup in his hands. He hasn't said her name out loud to another person in 3 years. Not to me. Not to anyone. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you that, so you understand what that means. She understood. Don't make him sorry he said it, Hector said. Not a threat, a request. The kind that comes from genuine care for someone. I won't, she said. He nodded once finished his coffee and let himself out. The following week the town came to her, not in person, in reputation, in the way that small towns have of conducting their conversations about a person through everyone except that person. Hector brought it back with the mail on Wednesday. Apparently Dust Creek had upgraded its assessment of Abigail Harper from entertainment to inconvenience. They're saying you've got Caleb wrapped around your finger, Hector reported, setting the mail on this table with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information he didn't create. Saying a woman like you must have some kind of trick. That's why you're still here. A woman like me, Abigail repeated. Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what does Caleb say about it? He doesn't know yet. Then let's not tell him. She picked up the mail and sorted it onto the table. He's got enough to deal with. Hector tilted his head. You're not going to be angry about it. Oh, I'm angry, she said simply. But I'm not going to burn up good energy on Ruth Morrison's opinions when there's fence to fix. That afternoon she fixed fence. 3 sections of the south line that had been weakening for weeks, each post needing to be reset in the baked earth with a post driver that was heavier than it looked, and a mallet that sent shock up through her arms with every swing. She worked through the worst heat of the day, stopping only to drink water and reset her grip. Caleb found her at the 3rd section halfway through the post. He stopped his horse, watched her work. Didn't say anything condescending about it, didn't offer to take over. Didn't make the particular face some men made when they saw a woman doing physical labor, that mixture of pity and contempt that she'd learned to recognize at distance. He got off his horse and picked up the 2nd mallet and started on the next post. They worked down the fence line together without speaking, and when they reached the end of the section and stood looking at the newly set posts, Caleb said, Ruth Morrison. She looked at him. Hector told me, he said, despite your instructions to the contrary. She made a mental note to have words with Hector. It doesn't matter. It does to me. His voice was quiet. Not angry, something more controlled than anger. What she said about you is wrong, and I want you to know I know that. She looked at him. All right. You're not here because of a trick. He looked at the fence line, at the work they'd just done together. You're here because you're the hardest working person on this mountain, including me. And I'm not an easy man to say that about. The heat of the afternoon was still thick and pressing. Somewhere in the lower pasture a cow called once and went quiet. A hawk drew a slow circle overhead. Abigail felt something crack very slightly in the part of her chest she kept most protected. Thank you, she said. The words came out quieter than she meant them to. He nodded, put his hat back on. "Water the horses when you're done with that last post," he said, and swung back up into the saddle. She watched him ride back toward the barn. Then she picked up the mallet and finished the post. 3 days later, Silas Boone rode onto the property himself. She hadn't seen him before, only the distant shapes of his riders on the ridge. Up close, he was both more and less than she'd imagined. A man of about 50, well-dressed for the frontier in the way that announced money without quite announcing taste. He had a face that smiled often, she could tell, but the smile never reached the same place twice. It was a working smile, a tool, not an expression. He came with 2 men riding behind him, and he came in the middle of the afternoon when Caleb was alone at the house and Hector was out with the herd. Abigail was at the well when he rode in. He looked at her with the smile already in place. "You must be the new bride," he said pleasantly. "Silas Boone. I own the land on both sides of your husbands." The word husband sat oddly in his mouth, not disrespectfully, but not naturally either, like he was trying it out to see how she'd react. "He's not my husband yet," she said. "And you're on his land." I am. Boone dismounted with the ease of a man who owned rooms by entering them. "Just came to call. Be neighborly." He looked around the yard at the repaired fence sections, the orderly state of the outbuildings, the clean condition of the water troughs, and she saw his eyes do a quick calculating inventory. "Place looks better," he said. "Last time I was here it was—" He waved a hand. "What do you want, Mr. Boone?" The pleasantness didn't leave his face, but something behind it adjusted. "I wanted to speak with Walker about his water access agreement, or lack thereof." He turned the smile back to her, easy and practiced. "I have a proposal, a fair one. I'd like him to hear it." "He'll be back by sundown," she said. "You're welcome to wait in the yard." "In the yard." He seemed to find this gently funny. "I see." He looked at her for a moment with the attentiveness of a man recalculating something. "You know, most women in your position would be grateful for a powerful neighbor, someone who could make things easier." "In my position," she said. He shrugged pleasantly. "Newcomer to a hard territory, no family connections here, a ranch that's been struggling." The smile. "I'm offering help." She held his gaze. "I'll let Mr. Walker know you called. Good afternoon, Mr. Boone." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and in that moment, the pleasantness thinned just enough to show what was underneath, not cruelty exactly. Certainty. The absolute unshakable certainty of a man who had never not gotten what he wanted, and had therefore stopped being able to imagine it. He tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, Miss Harper." He remounted. "Give my regards to your almost husband." She watched him ride off his property and didn't move until he was out of sight. Then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, and when she told him what had happened, his hands went still on the harness he was working. He was quiet for a moment, his back to her, and she could see the tension move through his shoulders. "He spoke to you directly," he said. "He did. That's new." He turned around. His face was composed, but his eyes had that storm cloud quality again, that unsettled, watchful depth. "Before you came, it was always through his men, or through intermediaries in town. He doesn't usually come himself." "He wanted to take a reading," she said. "Of the ranch. Of me." She paused. "He thinks the ranch is doing better. I think that bothers him." Caleb looked at her steadily. "It is doing better, I know." She met his eyes. "He'll try something new. The water channel is slow work. He came here because he wanted to see if there was a faster way." "And was there?" She shook her head. "Not through me." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then something in him seemed to settle. Not relax, but settle the way a man settles when he decides he can put weight on something and it'll hold. "All right," he said quietly. He turned back to the harness. She stood in the barn doorway a moment longer. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold on the mesa, and somewhere in the upper pasture, the cattle were moving slow and steady in the heat, and the water in the tank was running, and the fence was holding. All of this felt suddenly and acutely precarious, not weak, but delicate in the way that real things are delicate. The way that anything worth keeping requires constant tending. She understood standing there that she was not going to let Silas Boone take it. Any of it. That evening, Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table after dinner, and he looked at her in a way he hadn't looked at her before, open, a little uncertain, and entirely honest, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "Why are you still here?" She looked at him. The question was genuine. Not a test. Not manipulation. Just a man who had watched 3 women leave and genuinely could not understand what made the 4th stay. She thought about all the ways she could answer it. The practical ones, the polite ones. Then she said, "Because no one has ever given me a chance to show what I can do, not once in my whole life." Her voice was steady. "And this mountain, this hard-broken, drought-stricken, Boone-haunted mountain, is the first place I've ever stood, where the only thing between me and proving myself is the work." He looked at her for a long time. "And," she added quietly, "because the man I'd be leaving behind doesn't deserve to face all of this alone." The kitchen was very still. Caleb reached across the table, not to take her hand, just to set his beside hers close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, the rough and steady realness of it. "I put salve on your arm," he said. "First morning." "I know." That was... He stopped. "That was me saying something I didn't know how to say out loud yet." She turned her hand over and let it rest beside his. "I know that too," she said. Outside, the summer night pressed down on Red Mesa, and somewhere out in the dark, Silas Boone was making plans, and the water channel was running clear for now, and the cattle were settled, and the fence was holding. Everything was still fragile. Everything was still under threat. But in the kitchen of a hard-used ranch on a parched Arizona mountain, 2 people who had each been given very specific reasons not to trust sat across from each other with their hands almost touching, and neither of them moved away. The hand almost touching hers across the kitchen table that was on a Tuesday. By Thursday, everything had changed. It started with the cattle. Hector found the first one at dawn, lying in the lower pasture, and the way he came riding back to the ranch fast tight. Not the pace of a man bringing ordinary news told Abigail everything before he opened his mouth. She was at the well when he rode in. She saw his face and set down the bucket. "How many?" she asked. "2 dead, 3 more down and not getting up." He pulled his horse to a stop and looked past her toward the barn where Caleb was working. "It ain't natural, Miss Harper. The ones that are down, they've got the same thing wrong with them. Same look in the eyes. Same way they're lying." "Poisoned," she said. He met her eyes. "That's what I think." She turned toward the barn. "Caleb." He was already in the doorway. He'd heard the hoofbeats. She watched him listen to Hector. Watched the stillness come over him, that particular stillness that wasn't calm. That was the exact opposite of calm. That was a man holding something enormous, very tightly, to keep it from becoming a different kind of thing entirely. "Show me," he said. They rode to the lower pasture, and Caleb crouched beside the first dead animal for a long time, and when he stood up, his face was closed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the tired, wary closed of the first days, but something harder. Something that had made a decision. "Oleander," he said. "Somebody cut it and mixed it in the feed." "The feed we keep in the south storage," Hector said. "Who has access to that storage?" Abigail asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the dead cattle, then he said, "Anybody who can get past a standard latch in the dark, which means anybody." He pulled his hat down. "Move the surviving herd to the north pasture. Don't let them near the south storage or the south water troughs until we've checked everything." "Caleb," Hector started. "Do it now, Hector." Hector went. Caleb stood there a moment longer, looking at the animals, and Abigail stood beside him and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would fit inside the size of what was happening. 5 cattle. Maybe more by nightfall. 2 years of careful breeding and feeding and managing through drought. Gone. "He's escalating," she said finally. "Yeah." The water channel was slow. "This is faster." She looked at him. "He's in a hurry now. Something changed." Caleb turned and walked back toward his horse. "He came here himself. You told him the ranch was doing better. He didn't like what he saw. He mounted. Now he's not willing to wait us out anymore. She mounted Clara and followed him back toward the ranch, and her mind was already moving, not in panic in the cold, clear way it moved when things got serious, cataloging what they knew and what they needed to know, and how fast the gap between those two things could get them killed. We need evidence, she said. Not just the dead cattle, something that connects Boone directly. I know. Hector said the feed was fine yesterday morning when he checked it. That means someone was on this property last night. I know that too. Then we need to check the perimeter. Look for tracks, cut fence, anything that shows how they got in. She paused. And we need to do it before Boone's men come back to see if it worked. Caleb looked at her sideways, and in that look was something she was beginning to recognize. The particular attention of a man who kept getting surprised by the same person. You're good in a crisis, he said. I've had a lot of practice being in one, she said simply. They found the entry point at the southeast corner of the property, a clean cut in the fence wire, the kind made with proper tools, rather than force, done with enough care that it could be swung back into place and look intact from a distance. Fresh boot prints in the dust on the other side, 2 sets leading from the direction of the Boone land. Caleb photographed the tracks with the kind of detailed attention that said he'd done this before, memorizing depth spacing, boot size. Abigail found something better. At the base of the fence post, half hidden in the dried grass, a piece of cloth. Dark wool. Torn clean on a rough edge of wire. She held it up. Caleb looked at it. Boone's men wear that color, all of them. It's a kind of uniform. It's not proof on its own, she said. But it's a start. She put it in her coat pocket. They rode back to the ranch and found Hector waiting with news that 2 more cattle were down. Caleb took that without visible reaction, just nodded once, and told Hector to call the veterinarian in from Dust Creek, which would cost money they didn't easily have, and then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the wood. Abigail made coffee, set a cup in front of him, sat across from him. Talk to me, she said. He looked up. Don't go inside your head with this, she said. Talk to me. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the coffee and said, If I lose much more of the herd, the ranch stops being viable. Not this season, by spring. I won't have enough cattle to run a profitable operation. I'll have debt from the vet and the lost animals, and the water situation will still be unresolved. He said it flat and clear, the way you state facts, when the facts are bad enough that dressing them up would be an insult to how bad they are. Boone knows that. That's the math he's doing. Then we have to change the math, she said. How? We find enough evidence to take to the territorial authorities. Not just the cloth, something that shows intention, pattern, that this has been happening deliberately over time. She leaned forward. You said Boone hired the water board man, Garrett. Yeah, Garrett has to have put something in writing. Men like that always do. They justify their work to themselves. Keep records, cover themselves legally. If there's a paper trail connecting Boone to the channel blockages to the feed tampering, we'd need to get into Boone's records. Or find someone who's seen them, she thought. Who else has Boone pushed off land on this mesa? We can't be the only ones. Caleb was quiet. Then, the Reyes family, 3 years ago, lost their property to the south when their water dried up. He looked at the table. And before that, old man Cutter. He died before it went to court, and his daughter sold the land to cover his debts. Are either of them still in the territory? Louisa Reyes is. She's in Dust Creek, works at the laundry. Then I want to talk to her. He looked at her. Abigail, the name. First time. Not Miss Harper. Her name. She felt it land somewhere in her chest with quiet weight. This isn't... He stopped, started again. If Boone thinks you're building a case against him, he'll stop being subtle. He's been careful because he wants this done without attention. If he thinks someone's threatening that... I know, she said. You could get hurt. I know that too. She met his eyes. But I'm not going to sit here and watch him take everything you've built piece by piece while I keep the fence posts straight. That's not why I'm here. He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said very quietly, I know why you're here. The words were simple, But the way he said them, the weight behind them, the acknowledgement, the thing that was finally being said out loud, after weeks of being said only in actions and silences, made the air in the kitchen feel different. She held his eyes. "Good," she said. They rode down to Dust Creek the next morning. Both of them, which was the first time Caleb had come into town with her since she'd arrived. She noticed the stares it generated, the double takes, the lowered voices, the specific quality of attention that a small town directs at information it hasn't had a chance to process yet. Caleb noticed them too, and ignored them with the ease of a man who'd stopped caring what Dust Creek thought sometime around 1884. Louisa Reyes was a compact woman of about 40, with careful eyes and quick hands, and the particular manner of someone who had decided to rebuild a life that had been broken and was fully committed to the project. She was hanging sheets when Abigail approached, and she looked at Abigail the way she looked at the sheets, assessing efficient, not unkind. "You're Walker's woman," she said, not a question. "I'm going to be," Abigail said, "if we can keep the ranch." Louisa's hands stilled on the sheet. "Boone." "Yes." A long moment. Louisa looked past Abigail toward the street where Caleb waited with the horses. Then she looked back at Abigail, and something moved through her expression. Old anger, old grief, the look of someone being asked to go back into a room they'd worked very hard to leave. "Come inside," she said. What Louisa told them over the next 40 minutes was worse than they'd anticipated, and better than they'd feared. Worse, because the pattern of what Boone had done to the Reyes family, the water sabotage, the paid-off officials, the manufactured debt was systematic and deliberate, and clearly not the first time he'd done it. Better, because Louisa had kept records. Not from planning, she said, from rage. The particular meticulous rage of a woman who had watched everything she loved be taken and had written it all down because it was the only power she had left. Letters, dates, names of the officials Boone had paid. A sworn statement she'd given to the Territorial Land Office 2 years ago that had been filed and ignored, but filed, which meant it existed. "I gave up on it mattering," she said. She was looking at the papers on the table with an expression Abigail recognized from the inside, the specific exhaustion of someone who had tried to be believed and hadn't been. "After a while you start thinking you imagined how bad it was." "You didn't imagine it," Abigail said. "No." Louisa looked at her. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to add it to what we have, and I'm going to make it impossible to ignore." She looked at Caleb, who was reading one of the letters with his jaw tight. "We're going to take it to the town meeting next month, in front of everyone." Louisa was quiet. "He'll know before you get there." "I expect so." "He'll try to stop you." "I expect that too." Louisa looked at Caleb, then back at Abigail. Something shifted in her face slowly, the way ice shifts when it first begins to think about spring. "I'll testify," she said. "If it goes to a proper hearing, I'll stand up and say it." "Thank you," Abigail said. "Don't thank me yet." Louisa started folding the papers. "Thank me when Boone's in irons." They were back on the Mesa Trail when the trouble found them. Not subtle this time. Not riders on a ridge or blocked channels or poisoned feed. 2 men on the trail positioned at a narrow point where the path squeezed between rock walls and there was no easy way around. They were sitting their horses like men who had been told exactly where to be and exactly when. Caleb stopped. His hand dropped to his side in the unhurried way of a man who was very aware of where his gun was without being dramatic about it. "Walker," the larger of the 2 men said. He had the cloth patch of a Boone ranch hand on his vest. "Mr. Boone wants a word." "He knows where my ranch is," Caleb said. "He wants it now. You and the—" The man's eyes moved to Abigail, and he paused, and the pause had something ugly in it. "And the woman." Abigail held Clara steady and didn't react. "We're going home," Caleb said. His voice was completely level. "You want to pass a message to Boone, you're welcome to do that. But we're going home." The larger man shifted his horse to block more of the trail. "That ain't really a request, Walker." "I know it isn't." Caleb looked at him with the steady gray eyes and didn't blink. "But it's still my answer." The second man reached for his jacket. "Don't." Caleb's voice hadn't changed in pitch or speed, but something in it changed in quality, a finality, a flatness. Something that had been dealing with threats quietly for a long time and was very done with it. I know what you're reaching for. Put your hand back on your reins. Silence on the trail. The second man looked at the first man. Something passed between them. Then the first man said, "Mr. Boone is going to hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Caleb said. They moved their horses aside. Barely. Just enough. Caleb rode through without hurrying and without looking back, and Abigail followed, and she kept her eyes forward, and her spine straight, and her hands loose on the reins, even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. They didn't speak until the narrow point was well behind them. "You're shaking," Caleb said. "I know." She made no attempt to deny it. "I'm angry. Anger does that to me." He looked at her sideways. "You didn't show it." "I know," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. "That was well done." She let out a slow breath. They were going to take us to Boone, make us hear whatever he had to say on his terms in his space with his men around us. She looked at Caleb. "That's how men like him work. They take away your ground so they can offer you theirs like it's a gift." "Yes. He knows we've been talking to people. Had to assume that after Louisa." Caleb's jaw was set. "He's got eyes in town. Always has. He knows what we're building." "And he's scared," Caleb said. "That's what today was. A scared man making a move." He paused. Scared men are more dangerous than comfortable ones. She knew that. She'd known it for years in a different context. Men who were comfortable with the world as it was weren't the ones who came after you. It was the men who felt the world shifting under their certainty who got cruel. When they reached the ranch, Hector met them at the gate with a look on his face that added another weight to the pile. "Someone was here while you were gone," he said. "Went through the house." Abigail's stomach dropped. She pushed past him and went inside, and her eyes went immediately to the kitchen, the table, the loose board in the floor beneath it, where she'd been keeping the cloth evidence and her written notes. She crouched and pulled the board up. The cloth was still there. The notes were still there. She sat back on her heels and let out the breath she'd been holding. "They didn't find it," Caleb said from the doorway. "No." She replaced the board and stood. "But they were looking for something specific. This wasn't random. They know we have evidence." He came fully into the kitchen. "Or suspect we do. We need to move it." She was already thinking. "Not keep it here, if they come back with more men." "Louisa," Caleb said. She looked at him. "She kept records for 2 years without Boone finding them," he said. "She knows how to hide things." "Yes." Abigail nodded once. "And I need to write to the Territorial Land Office tonight. Send copies of everything before the meeting. So even if something happens to the originals." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Caleb said. The directness of it. The simple, unadorned declaration stopped her mid-thought. She looked at him. How was standing in this kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes entirely clear, and he looked like a man who had been building towards saying something and had finally arrived. "I said I couldn't stop those other women from leaving," he said. "I said by the time I found the words they were already gone." He held her gaze. "I'm not making that mistake again." She stood very still. "Whatever Boone does, whatever comes next." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she could see every line the sun had drawn on his face, the honest exhaustion and the honest stubbornness, and underneath all of it, something so carefully guarded and so plainly terrified and so stubbornly alive that her throat tightened with the seeing of it. "I'm not watching you walk out that door because I waited too long to say the thing I should have said, Caleb," she said softly. "I'm saying it now," he said. "So there's no confusion later." He reached out, and his hand, rough and warm and entirely steady, found her face and held it. "You came here for a chance. I'm asking you to give me one too." She put her hand over his. "You already have it," she said. He kissed her the way a man who has been alone too long and known too much loss kisses someone with his whole self in it. Nothing held back. Nothing, performing just the plain and aching truth of it. She kissed him back the same way because that was the only honest response there was. Outside on the mesa, Silas Boone was making his plans. The water channel was running. The cattle that were left were thin but alive. The evidence was hidden under a kitchen floor, and in a laundry woman's drawer, and in Abigail's careful handwriting on 3 separate sheets of paper that she would post to the Territorial Land Office before tomorrow's sun was up. Everything was still dangerous. Everything was still in motion. But in the kitchen of the Walker Ranch, with the summer night pressing down on Red Mesa, and the distant sound of the cattle settling in the upper pasture, Caleb Walker held on to Abigail Harper, and she held on to him back, and neither of them let go. That was a Thursday. On Sunday, Boone made his move. It happened at the water source. Abigail had ridden up the north face alone. Caleb was in town filing a complaint with the sheriff, a long shot but a necessary step in the paper trail they were building, and Hector was with the herd. She'd gone up to check the channel the way she did every few days now, the way you check a wound, keeps getting reopened. She found it blocked again. Third time. And this time, they hadn't just used rocks, they'd used timber, a real structure, something that would take hours to dismantle without tools she hadn't brought. She was assessing the damage when she heard the horses. 3 of them. She turned, and there were Boone's 2 men from the trail, plus a third she hadn't seen before, and they were between her and the path back down. The third man was Garrett. She recognized him from Hector's description. The waterboard man, the engineer, the one who knew exactly where to put a blockage so it held. He was a thin man of about 50, with small, careful eyes and ink stains on his fingers, even out here, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's been asked to remove. "Miss Harper," he said, "you're a long way from the ranch house." She said nothing. She was calculating the distance to Clara, who was tied 30 feet away, and whether she could reach her before they could close the gap, and whether that calculation even mattered if there were 3 of them. It didn't. "Mr. Boone would really like you to stop," Garrett said pleasantly. "All of this, the records, the letters, the visits to town. It's causing a great deal of unnecessary trouble." He tilted his head. "Mr. Boone is a patient man, but he does have limits." "Does he?" she said. "He wanted me to give you a choice." Garrett reached into his jacket and produced a piece of paper. "Simple agreement. The Walker Ranch accepts a fair market buyout. You and Mr. Walker take the money and leave the territory. Everyone moves on." She looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. "And if we don't?" she asked. Garrett folded the paper back into his jacket. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. "You should know something," she said, "before you go back to Boone with my answer." "What's that?" "Those letters you're looking for, the evidence. It's already in the mail, as of yesterday morning." She looked at him steadily. 3 copies. Territorial Land Office, the federal marshal in Tucson, and a newspaper editor in Phoenix who has a particular interest in land fraud stories. She paused. "So, whatever you're thinking about doing up here on this mountain, it already doesn't matter. The information is already out." The silence stretched. She watched Garrett's small, careful eyes do the calculation. Watched him run the numbers. Watched the moment he arrived at the answer she was counting on him to arrive at, that touching her. Now would be the worst possible move, because it would confirm everything she'd sent. He put his hat back on. "Mr. Boone will be in touch," he said. "He knows where to find us," she said. They rode down the north face and left her alone with the blocked channel and her racing heart and her absolute unshaking refusal to let a single one of them see her hands tremble. She gave them 10 minutes. Then she sat down on the rock beside the channel and shook like a leaf for a full 2 minutes because she was human, and it had been genuinely terrifying, and there was no one up here to see it, so she gave herself those 2 minutes to be scared. Then she stood up, rolled her sleeves back, and started dismantling the blockage by hand. She'd gotten halfway through it when she heard a horse coming up the trail fast, and she turned with her heart in her mouth, but it was Caleb, not Boone's men. He came around the last bend and saw her and pulled up hard, and the look on his face when he took in the scene, the dismantled blockage, the state of her hands. The 3 sets of hoofprints in the dust leading away aged him and settled him simultaneously. He got off his horse. He walked to her. He took her hands. both of them looking at the scrapes on her palms from the rocks, and held them carefully. "Hector saw them right up the north face," he said. His voice was controlled, just barely. "I came as fast as I could." "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are." He held her hands a moment longer. "I know you are." He looked at the cleared channel, at what she'd done alone up here. Something crossed his face that was beyond pride, that was something quieter and more permanent. "Did they hurt you?" "No. I told them about the letters." His eyes came up to hers. "You bluffed." "It wasn't entirely a bluff. I did send letters. I just—" She almost smiled. "I may have exaggerated the Phoenix newspaper element." He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was short and rough and surprised and entirely real the same. Short, surprised laugh she'd heard at the dinner table with Hector, and she felt it hit her square in the chest. "Lord," he said. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he agreed. He was still holding her hands. His thumbs moved once across her knuckles, careful and deliberate. "We need to go back down. I don't want to be on this trail after dark with Boone's men somewhere loose." "I know." She looked at the channel running clear again. Now the water finding its level, doing what water does when you stop blocking it. "We finish the channel repair tomorrow, both of us, properly." "Properly," he agreed. They rowed down together, close watching the shadows, and the water ran down from the north face into the storage tank, and the summer night came down over Red Mesa, and somewhere south of them, in a well-appointed ranch house that sat on stolen land. Silas Boone opened a letter he hadn't expected to receive, and read the kind of words that men who believe themselves untouchable very rarely read. The kind that told him the ground was moving. The kind that told him he was running out of time. The letters reached Tucson in 4 days. Abigail knew, because the federal marshal's office sent a reply. Not a promise, not a commitment, but an acknowledgement. A real one signed by a real name, saying the information had been received and was under review. She read it 3 times, standing at the gate, where Hector had handed it to her, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and went back to work, because there was still work to do, and standing still had never been something she was good at. She showed it to Caleb at dinner. He read it once, set it on the table, looked at it for a moment the way a man looks at something he'd stopped letting himself hope for. "It's not over," she said. "Not yet." "Not?" "No," he agreed. "But it's different now." He looked up at her. "Before this, we were just a struggling ranch with a powerful neighbor who wanted our water. Now there's a federal name on a piece of paper that knows his name too." He folded the letter and slid it back to her. "That changes what he can do without it looking like exactly what it is. He'll try something before the town meeting," she said. "He has to, if this goes public in front of the whole town with Louisa standing up and the marshal's letter in hand." "He loses the story," Caleb said. "Right now, he's the successful landowner, and I'm the stubborn holdout. The meeting flips that." "So we have 2 weeks," she said. "And he knows it too." Caleb nodded slowly. The kitchen was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that had a different quality than it did 6 weeks ago. Not empty, not wary, but settled. Shared. Like the quiet of people who have decided they're in the same place, and don't need to announce it constantly to know it's true. Under the table, his knee was resting against hers. Neither of them mentioned it. "Sleep with the door latched," he said. "Both of us. Until this is done." "I already do," she said. He almost smiled. "I know, I check." She looked at him. "You check." "Every night." He stood and took his plate to the basin, not looking at her. "Old habit, making sure the house is secure." She watched his back and thought about a man who walked the perimeter of his own life every night to make sure nothing else had been taken, and felt something in her chest go so tender it was almost painful. "Caleb," she said. He turned. "After the meeting," she said. "When this is settled, I want to talk about what comes next, for us." She held his eyes. "Not the ranch. Us." He was very still. "Yes," he said. "Just that." But the way he said it like a door opening the rest of the way. She nodded once and went to bed, and she lay in the dark and listened to him check the latch on her door from the outside, and then walk down the hall to his own room, and she thought that was possibly the most love she had ever felt in a single quiet moment. The first move came 5 days before the meeting. Sheriff Eddings rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with his deputy behind him, and a look on his face that mixed discomfort with a kind of practiced authority that Abigail recognized immediately as the look of a man doing someone else's errand. "Walker," he said, staying on his horse. "Got a complaint filed against you." Caleb came off the porch slowly. "What kind of complaint?" "Water theft." Eddings had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable about it. "Silas Boone says you've been diverting water from the shared source, rerouting it away from his eastern properties." The silence that followed had a shape to it. Abigail came to stand beside Caleb on the step. "That's backwards," Caleb said. His voice was quiet. "He's been blocking my intake channel 3 times in the last 2 months. I have documentation." "Well, he's got documentation too." Eddings shifted in his saddle. "Says he's got a survey showing the source water historically flows east. Your channel diverts it north." "That survey is from 1879, Caleb said, "before my intake was built, with the knowledge and approval of the Territorial Land Office." "Be that as it may," Eddings started, "Sheriff." Abigail's voice was level. "We've sent documentation to the Federal Marshal's office in Tucson regarding a pattern of deliberate interference with our water access by Mr. Boone. We have physical evidence, witness testimony, and records going back 2 years. She paused. "Is Mr. Boone aware of that correspondence?" Eddings looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not guilt, but the particular discomfort of a man suddenly conscious of being on the wrong side of a ledger that's about to be made public. "I'm just delivering the complaint, ma'am." "I understand, and will respond to it through proper channels." She held his gaze. "Just like we've responded to everything else." Eddings looked at Caleb, then back at her. Then he touched his hat brim and said, "Complaint's been logged. You'll need to appear before Justice Hale before the end of the month." "We'll be there," Caleb said. The sheriff rode out. The deputy followed without making eye contact. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go, and his jaw was working in a way that told Abigail exactly how much he was holding back. "He's trying to tie you up in legal proceedings before the meeting," she said. "Get you on the defensive. Make it look like you're the problem." "I know. We need Luisa's testimony sooner rather than later. And the Cutter daughter, you said she sold land to cover debt. If Boone manufactured that debt the way he manufactured ours." "Clara Cutter married a man in Flagstaff. I haven't spoken to her in 3 years." "Do you know his name?" Caleb looked at her. "Abigail, his name," she said again. He looked at the sky for a moment. "Thomas Aldridge. He runs a freight business." She went inside and wrote the letter before lunch. What came back faster than she'd expected 10 days later? 2 days before the meeting was not just a letter. Clara Aldridge, née Cutter, arrived on the afternoon stage with a carpet bag and a folder of papers under her arm, and a look in her eyes that Abigail recognized from Luisa Reyes, and from her own mirror, the look of a woman who had been waiting for a very long time for someone to ask the right question. "I've been holding on to these for 4 years, Clara said, sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open between them. "My lawyer told me there was nothing to be done, that Boone was too connected." She looked at Abigail directly. "Then I got your letter. The papers were better than anything they had." A promissory note with Boone's signature issued to an intermediary who had then called in Clara's father's debts simultaneously from 3 directions. A letter from Garrett, the water's engineer, Boone's man, describing the elder Cutter's water situation as untenable within 6 months, written 18 months before it became untenable. A map with handwritten notations showing Boone's planned land acquisitions, dated 2 years before each of the ranches on it failed. It was a plan, written down, in ink. Caleb sat across from them reading it, and the color had drained out of his face. Not with fear, but with the specific shock of having a thing you'd suspected for years confirmed in black and white. "He mapped it all out," he said. "Before any of it happened," Clara said. "My father's property, the Reyes land, yours." She pointed to a notation beside a rough sketch of Red Mesa. This says, water acquisition final phase. Your ranch is the last piece. The kitchen was so quiet that the sound of the cattle moving in the upper pasture came through the walls. How did you keep this safe for 4 years? Abigail asked. Clara looked at her hands. My father knew something was wrong before he died. He hid these in the lining of his Bible. I found them when I was packing his things. She paused. I didn't know what to do with them alone, and I was scared. She looked up. I'm still scared, but I'm more tired of being scared than I am afraid of him. Abigail put her hand over Clara's. You won't be standing alone, she said. The night before the town meeting, Boone made his last move. It came at 2 in the morning. Not his riders, not Garrett, not a complaint through the sheriff. Something simpler and crueler. Someone cut the main water pipe between the storage tank and the ranch house. Clean cut, deliberate, and it wasn't discovered until Caleb went to wash up at dawn and nothing came through. He found the cut pipe, and he came back to the house, and he stood in the kitchen, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and Abigail watched him work through something very large and very old. The accumulated weight of 2 years of small cruelties and deliberate erosions. Every blocked channel and poisoned calf and manufactured legal complaint. All of it stacked on top of the 6 years before that. The loss that had brought him here in the first place. The whole long history of a man who had been asked to absorb too much and had done it alone because there was no other option. Caleb, she said. He looked up. His eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, not quite. But he was close in the way that a man who never cries gets close, which was somehow more affecting than tears would have been. He cut the pipe, Caleb said. The night before the meeting, he cut the pipe. I know. I've been fixing things on this ranch for 6 years. Every time something breaks, I fix it. Every time he takes something, He stopped. I'm tired, Abigail. She crossed the kitchen and put her hand on his face, the way he had put his hand on hers. Direct. Steady. I know you are. I don't know if one town meeting... Hey. She held his face until he looked at her. Listen to me. We have Louisa. We have Clara and her father's papers. We have the marshal's acknowledgement and the physical evidence and 3 months of documented interference. She looked at him steadily. And we have each other. That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing. He covered her hand with his. No, he said quietly. It's not. Now. She stepped back. Help me fix the pipe before we ride to town. I am not letting Silas Boone have the satisfaction of knowing he inconvenienced our morning. Something came back into his eyes. That almost smile. The one she'd learned to watch for. Yes, ma'am, he said. They fixed the pipe in an hour. Hector helped, working fast and silent and angry in the particular way of a loyal man whose patience has been exhausted. Clara Aldridge slept in the spare room and came out at first light, ready, her folder of papers under her arm. They ate breakfast together, all 4 of them, and Abigail made biscuits because she'd found that feeding people before hard things was one of the most honest forms of care she knew. The ride into Dust Creek felt different from every other ride she'd made into that town. Every other time she'd ridden down from Red Mesa, she'd been aware of herself, her size, her position. The way eyes tracked her on the street, the background noise of other people's opinions following her like a second shadow. She'd managed it. She'd refused to let it stop her. But she'd been aware of it always, the way you're always aware of a stone in your shoe, even when you're determined not to limp. Today, she didn't feel it. She wasn't sure if that was because something in her had changed, or because something in the situation had changed, and the distinction didn't seem important. She rode into Dust Creek beside Caleb Walker, with Louisa Reyes and Clara Aldridge behind them, and Hector bringing up the rear, and she held her head straight and her shoulders back and her eyes forward, and the stone in her shoe was gone. The meeting hall was full. Dust Creek didn't have many entertainments, and a public dispute always drew a crowd, but Abigail thought the fullness of the room had something extra in it today. A tension, a buzz, the particular electricity of people who had heard rumors and come to find out if they were true. Ruth Morrison was in the 3rd row. Harold Briggs, who had bet she'd last 3 days, was in the back. Sheriff Eddings was near the door with his arms crossed. And in the front row, perfectly composed in a good suit that cost more than most men in the room, made in a month, sat Silas Boone. He saw her come in. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did a quick assessment, a recalculation, and then the composed pleasantness was back in place, like a shutter being closed. She met his gaze and held it for exactly long enough to make clear she wasn't going to look away first. Then she walked to the front of the room. Justice Hale called the meeting to order, ran through the formal complaints on both sides, and then opened the floor. Boone's lawyer went first. Smooth practiced the kind of presentation that was designed to make the opposition feel small before they'd said a word. Survey data. Historical water rights. The counter-complaint against Caleb for alleged diversion. The implication never stated outright but fully present that a struggling ranch run by a man with a history of failed relationships and a mail-order bride who'd been the butt of the town's jokes for 3 months was hardly a credible source of accusations against a man of Boone's standing. Abigail heard Ruth Morrison murmur something to the woman next to her and felt the familiar heat start behind her eyes. She let it come. She used it. When Hale nodded to her side, she stood up. She didn't have a lawyer. She had herself and Louise's testimony, and Clara's papers, and 3 months of careful documentation, and 29 years of being told she wasn't enough. She started with the facts. Date by date, she walked the room through 2 years of water sabotage, the blocked channels, the timing, the deliberate technical knowledge that each blockage required. Garrett's name. The letter that proved he was employed by Boone before the first blockage occurred. The cloth evidence from the fence cut. The poisoned feed. The dates, the losses, the money spent on veterinary care for cattle that had been deliberately killed. The room was very quiet. She set Clara Aldridge's papers on the table in front of Justice Hale. These are original documents from the estate of Thomas Cutter, deceased. They include a map in Mr. Boone's handwriting showing planned land acquisitions, including this ranch dated before the events that forced each of those sales. She paused. This is not a neighbor dispute over water rights. This is a systematic campaign to bankrupt landowners on Red Mesa in order to consolidate water access. She looked at Hale. And it has been happening for at least 6 years. She heard something shift in the room. Not noise exactly, a kind of realignment, the sound of people updating their understanding of a situation. Luisa Reyes stood up from the back without being called and said, "Everything she said happened to us too, to my family. I gave a statement to the land office 2 years ago. I can tell you the number of that filing if you want to check whether it was properly recorded or whether it was buried." The silence this time had a different quality. Boone's lawyer was on his feet making objections, and Hale was calling for order, and in the front row, Silas Boone sat with his composed face and his good suit, and his expression had not cracked, but something behind it had that absolute certainty, that unshakable conviction that the world would continue to arrange itself according to his preferences. It was cracking. She could see it from where she stood. "Mr. Boone," Hale said when order was restored. "These are serious allegations with documentary support. I'm going to need to see your survey records and your employment records for Mr. Garrett." He looked over his glasses. "This meeting is adjourned pending a formal review. I'm requesting the Territorial Land Office send a representative, and I'm forwarding Miss Harper's documentation to the Federal Marshal's office in Tucson." Boone stood. His pleasantness was entirely gone now, and what was underneath was what she'd seen in his eyes that first day. The naked, bewildered fury of a man who simply could not understand how this had happened. "This is," he started. "Mr. Boone." Hale's voice was final. "Sit down or step outside." A beat. The room was absolutely still. Boone looked at Abigail. She looked back at him and felt nothing except the clean, steady truth of having done the thing that needed doing. He sat down. The crowd erupted the moment Hale's gavel came down, not in applause, not yet, but in the tumbling, urgent sound of a room full of people who have just had something large rearranged in their understanding of the world they live in. Voices, questions, people turning to their neighbors. The particular noise of a community processing the fact that what they'd accepted as normal had been something else entirely. Ruth Morrison, in the third row, was very quiet. Caleb found Abigail's hand in the crowd and held it, and she held his back, and Hector was shaking Clara Aldridge's hand. and Luisa Reyes was standing straight and still, with the expression of someone who had finally put down a weight they'd been carrying for years. Outside, the summer sun was beating down on Dust Creek the way it always did, hard and indifferent, and entirely without sympathy for anyone's circumstances. But something had changed in the air. Abigail felt it the moment they walked out of the meeting hall and onto the street, some shift in the quality of the attention directed at her that was different from the attention of the first day. Not hostile, not mocking, watching. A man she didn't know touched his hat brim as she passed. A woman called across the street, "Miss Harper." Just that, her name, with a different weight in it than she was used to. Caleb was walking beside her, and he leaned down slightly and said very quietly close to her ear, "You know what just happened in there?" "We bought time," she said. "It's not over." "No," he agreed. But the story changed. He looked at her. "They came in here today thinking they knew what this was. You just showed them what it actually was." He squeezed her hand once. "That matters. That's the kind of thing that doesn't go back the way it was." She looked at the street, at the town that had laughed the day she arrived, at the people who were watching her now with something different in their faces, and thought about a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 3 months ago, with her heart hammering and her chin up and nothing but a carpet bag and a refusal to fold. She hadn't folded. She wasn't done yet. But standing here on this street in the afternoon sun, with Caleb Walker's hand in hers, and Luisa Reyes walking beside her with her head up, and Clara Aldridge's papers safely in Justice Hale's hands, she let herself feel just for a moment, just for the length of one honest breath, what it felt like to have stood her ground and not moved. It felt like the first clean water after a long drought. It felt like enough. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet, but would. The formal review took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Abigail waking before dawn and going to check the water tank and finding it running, not because the threat was over, but because Boone had gone quiet in the particular way that meant he was waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow before he committed to his next move. 3 weeks of Caleb riding the fence lines every evening and coming back to the kitchen where she had dinner waiting, and the two of them sitting across from each other and talking. Really talking the way people talk when they've decided to stop being careful with each other. 3 weeks of something building between them that neither of them named yet, because there was still too much unresolved, and naming it felt like counting money you hadn't been paid. The Territorial Land Office representative arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Aldous Marsh, a dry, precise man of about 60, who wore his authority quietly and asked questions with the patience of someone who had seen a great deal of land fraud in his career and was no longer surprised by any of it. He spent 2 days on Red Mesa, one at the ranch going through their documentation, one riding the water source, and the channel with Caleb measuring and noting and saying very little. On the second evening, he sat at the kitchen table and drank Abigail's coffee and looked at the map from Clara Cutter's father's Bible for a long time. "This is Boone's handwriting?" he asked. Clara Aldridge confirmed it, Abigail said. "She watched him sign documents for her father before the debt was called. She knows his hand." Marsh set the map down. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Harper, Mr. Walker." He looked between them. "What you have here is substantial. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to look at it plainly." He paused. "The question is whether the people in a position to act are willing to look at it plainly." "And are they?" Caleb asked. Marsh was quiet for a moment. "The federal marshal's office is interested. That letter you sent was the 3rd complaint to reach Tucson with Boone's name in it in 2 years. The first 2 were set aside." He looked at the map again. "This one won't be." Abigail felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first real suggestion of it. "How long?" "The marshal will want to come himself. Another 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Marsh folded his hands on the table. "In the meantime, I am formally suspending Boone's counter-complaint against this ranch. The diversion allegation has no evidentiary basis, and I should not have allowed it to proceed as far as it did." He said that last part with the clipped precision of a man acknowledging a failure he did not intend to repeat. "The water rights on this property are yours, Mr. Walker. They were always yours. I'm putting that in writing before I leave tomorrow." Caleb was very still. "Thank you," he said. It came out rough. Marsh nodded once and finished his coffee and excused himself to the spare room. And when he was gone, Caleb sat at the table and looked at the wood grain for a long moment. And Abigail let him have that moment because she understood what it meant. Not just the legal confirmation, but the weight of 2 years of being told he was wrong about his own land, his own water, his own life, finally being lifted by the voice of someone with the authority to lift it. She reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that in the quiet kitchen until the lamp burned low. The marshal arrived 18 days later. His name was Garrett Cole, no relation to Boone's waterman, which Hector pointed out with grim humor, and he was a broad, unhurried man who arrived with 2 deputies and a warrant already signed, and a manner that suggested he had made this particular kind of ride before, and knew exactly how it ended. He stopped at the ranch first. "I've read everything you sent," he told Abigail, sitting across from her at the kitchen table that had become the nerve center of this whole operation. "3 times. You put this together well." "I had help," she said. "Luisa Reyes, Clara Aldridge." He nodded. "Both have agreed to give formal statements. That combined with the documentary evidence and the water board testimony Marsh is providing." He paused. "Silas Boone is going to have a very bad week." "Is it enough?" Caleb asked. "For fraud, yes. For the land theft from the Reyes family, yes. For the interference with your water access." Cole looked between them. "All of it, yes. This is enough." He stood. "We're riding to his property this afternoon. I wanted you to know before we went." After he left, the ranch was very quiet. Hector came and sat on the porch and didn't say anything, and Caleb stood in the yard looking toward the east, toward Boone's land, and Abigail stood beside him and let the silence be what it was. "It's not how I imagined it ending," Caleb said. "How did you imagine it?" "I thought about it. Worse. I imagined it ending with me losing the ranch and riding out with nothing and Boone watching from his porch." He paused. "Or not ending at all. Just going on indefinitely. Him pressing me, holding nothing ever resolving." "But it is resolving," she said. "Because you walked into it." He looked at her. "You walked into a fight that wasn't yours and made it yours." "It was mine," she said simply. "The moment I decided to stay, it was mine." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Marry me." Not the way she'd imagined a proposal might come, no orchestration, no particular moment arranged for effect. Just Caleb Walker, standing in his yard on a hot Arizona morning, looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a world that had spent 2 years trying to shift under his feet. She felt it go through her like clean water. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed, the short, surprised, real laugh she loved. And then he pulled her close and held her the way a man holds something he has been afraid to hold for a very long time, carefully and completely. And she put her arms around him and held him back just as hard. Hector on the porch said, "Finally," to no one in particular, and went inside to put more coffee on. The news of Boone's arrest reached Dust Creek before supper. Marshal Cole had ridden onto the Boone property with his deputies and his warrant, and found Boone in his study at his desk, apparently surrounded by papers, as if he'd been expecting this, and had decided to meet it with the dignity of a man who controlled the terms of everything, including his own downfall. Cole said later that Boone had looked at the warrant for a long time before he stood up, that he hadn't argued, that the only thing he'd said was, "I'll need my lawyer." By the time the news reached the street, it had already begun to change shape the way news always does in small towns, growing details here, losing others there. The essential truth remaining, but the texture around it shifting with each telling. What stayed consistent in every version was the warrant, the federal authority. The fact that Garrett the water engineer had been picked up at his boarding house in Dust Creek an hour after Boone, and that he had, according to multiple witnesses, started talking before Cole's deputy had finished reading the charges. Abigail heard the news from Luisa, who rode up to the ranch the following morning, with her eyes bright and her spine straighter than Abigail had ever seen it. "He's in the territorial jail in Tucson," Luisa said. "Both of them. Garrett, too." She was standing in the ranch yard, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite, and Abigail thought she understood that the specific trembling that comes not from fear, but from something very heavy being set down after years of carrying it. My land is... She stopped. The marshal's office is reviewing what happened to my family's property. Cole says there may be grounds for restitution. Abigail stepped forward and held her, and Louisa let herself be held for exactly a moment, brief, precise, allowing herself just that much before she stepped back and straightened and pressed her lips together. Good, Abigail said. Yes. Louisa looked at the ranch, at the fencing, the orderly yard, the tank that was running clear. You did this. We did this, Abigail said. Louisa shook her head once, but she was almost smiling. The summer festival was Dust Creek's biggest annual event, a week of market days and music, and the particular communal celebration of a town that spent the rest of the year too spread out across the mesa and the valley to gather easily. It fell 3 weeks after the arrests, and the Walker Ranch went together. Caleb and Abigail Hector and Clara Aldridge, who had stayed on in Dust Creek longer than she'd planned, and seemed, Abigail noticed, to find reasons to be wherever Hector was. She said nothing about that to anyone. She just noticed. Dust Creek felt different when they rode in, not transformed. It was still Dust Creek, still the same dirt street and same storefronts and same faces she'd been seeing for 3 months. But the quality of the attention was different. The eyes that found her when she dismounted from Clara were not the eyes from the first day. Not the measuring, mocking, cataloging eyes of people deciding what category she belonged in. A man near the livery said, "Morning, Miss Harper," and meant it as straightforward greeting, no undertone, nothing loaded in it. A woman she didn't know touched her arm as she passed and said, "What you did at that meeting. My husband's family lost land to Boone 10 years ago, before we even knew to look for a pattern." Her voice was tight with old feeling. "We never could have..." She stopped. "Thank you." Abigail looked at her. "What's your name?" The woman blinked. "May Hollis." May. She held the woman's eyes. "You're welcome." She felt Caleb's hand at the small of her back, light, present. Not possessive, but simply there, the particular touch of a person, marking that they are beside you, without requiring you to stop being yourself. And she let herself feel the weight of the morning without deflecting it. Ruth Morrison was at the market stalls. Abigail saw her from 20 feet away and held the moment. The moment before Ruth saw her, while she still had the choice of how to handle it. She could walk a different direction. She could simply not engage. She had won something real, and Silas Boone was in a territorial jail, and the water was running, and Caleb had asked her to marry him in the yard, and none of that required Ruth Morrison's acknowledgement. But Ruth looked up, and something happened in Ruth Morrison's face that Abigail had not expected. Not the sharpened smile, not the practiced pleasantness with the edge in it. Something that looked genuinely and uncomfortably like shame. "Miss Harper," Ruth said. "Mrs. Morrison." Ruth set down what she was looking at and clasped her hands and looked at Abigail with the expression of a woman who had been rehearsing something. "I said things. About you. When you first arrived and since." She paused. "They were unkind. And they were wrong." Another pause. "I wanted you to know I know that." The morning went very still around that moment. Abigail looked at her. At the stiffness of her posture and the genuine discomfort in her face, and the effort it had clearly taken to form those words and say them out loud. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. Just that. Quietly, without triumph. Ruth nodded. Something loosened in her shoulders. It wasn't a friendship. It wasn't an erasure of everything that had been said. But it was honest, and Abigail had always valued honesty more than comfort, so she took it for what it was and moved on. Caleb had watched from a few feet away. When she reached him, he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. "You didn't have to be gracious about that," he said. "I know." She looked at the market around them, at the town that had laughed the day she arrived, and was now in its small, imperfect human way recalibrating. "But I meant it. What I said about not burning good energy on other people's opinions." She looked at him. "The opinions have changed. That took something from her. I'm not going to make it harder than it already was." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being surprised by you," he said. "Good," she said. You should be. The festival had a dancing area at the center of the main street, and by mid-afternoon it was full fiddle music and the shuffling of boots and the particular joy of people who work hard all year, giving themselves permission to stop for a few hours. Abigail stood at the edge of it and watched and felt something warm and ordinary move through her, the pleasure of a crowd that was not watching her as a spectacle, but simply existing around her. Hector was dancing with Clara Aldridge, who it turned out could dance considerably better than he could and bore this with great patience. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at him. "You dance?" "No," he said. "But I'd like to try, with you, in public." He held out his hand. "Specifically here, specifically now." She understood what he was saying. This was the spot. The main street of Dust Creek where the crowd had laughed the day she stepped off the stagecoach. This was the same dirt under their feet, the same storefronts, the same summer sky. And he was asking her to stand in the middle of it with him and let whatever people thought about that be their problem. She took his hand. I was not a good dancer. He'd been entirely honest about that. He was stiff and a half-beat behind the music, and at one point stepped on her foot and said, "Sorry, sorry," in a way that made her laugh out loud, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. But he didn't let go of her hand, and he didn't look anywhere but at her. And when the fiddle slowed into something easier, he pulled her a little closer, and they moved together in the simple way of two people who have learned each other's rhythms through 3 months of hard work and hard weather and chose to keep choosing. Around them people danced. Some watched. Some looked away. Nobody laughed. Harold Briggs, who had bet she'd last 3 days, tipped his hat at her from across the street. She nodded back. When the music stopped, she and Caleb stood in the middle of the dance floor, and he looked down at her, and his face was open in a way she'd almost never seen it. Not guarded, not tired, not holding something back. Just present. Just his. "You know what today is," he said. "The festival. It's been exactly 3 months since you stepped off that stagecoach." His thumb moved across her knuckles. 3 months since they laughed. She looked around the street. At the people going about the ordinary joy of the afternoon. At Luisa Reyes, at the edge of the market, talking to a woman. Abigail didn't know, standing straight, carrying nothing heavy in her posture for the first time since they'd met. At Hector attempting a second dance with Clara, while Clara tried to teach him the steps with the patience of a woman who had decided he was worth the effort. At Caleb's hand holding hers. "They don't laugh anymore," she said. "No," he said. "They don't." She leaned up and kissed him right there in the middle of Dust Creek's main street, in the middle of the summer festival, in the exact spot where a crowd had decided she was a punchline 3 months ago. A few people clapped. Hector whistled. Someone said, "About time." And she thought it might have been Ruth Morrison, but couldn't be sure and didn't particularly care. What came after was not a single dramatic moment, but something better. The accumulation of ordinary days that added up to a life. The formal charges against Boone proceeded through the fall and into the following year, and the territorial court found him liable for fraudulent land practices against 3 families, including the Reyes. Louisa received a settlement. The Cutter land debt was ruled manufactured. Garrett testified against Boone in exchange for a reduced sentence and confirmed in writing what Clara's father's papers had already shown, that it had been planned, all of it, from the beginning. Boone's land holdings were placed under a court-supervised trust pending final resolution. The water rights of Red Mesa were formally adjudicated and placed in a cooperative structure that gave all the ranchers on the mesa equal access to the source. Caleb Walker received a document from the Federal Land Office confirming his deed in full, with a notation acknowledging the unlawful interference he had sustained. He framed it, not because he needed the reminder, but because Abigail told him to, and he'd learned that when she told him to do something, it was worth doing. They married in October at the ranch with Hector and Louisa and Clara and Marsh, the land office man, and a preacher from the next town, and about 30 people from Dust Creek who came because they wanted to, not because they were watching to see if it would last. The ceremony was short. The preacher asked the traditional questions. Caleb answered in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely without performance, the voice of a man who had decided a thing and was simply stating it plainly. Abigail answered the same way. When it was done, and the preacher had said the words, and Caleb had kissed her in front of everyone, with the same total unself-consciousness with which he did everything that mattered. Luisa Reyes caught Abigail's eye from the edge of the gathered crowd and gave her a single small, real smile. The smile of a woman who had watched something be set right and was glad of it. Abigail smiled back. 1 year after that, a full summer after the stagecoach, after the fire and the cattle and the blocked channels and the kitchen table and the town meeting and the dance in the street. Hector found Caleb on the north fence line in the early morning and said, "You should come." Caleb came. Abigail was in the main house, and the midwife from Dust Creek was with her, and by the time the sun had fully cleared the mesa, the sound that came from the house was the particular sound that changes everything. The first cry of something new, something that had not been in the world until that exact moment, and now was. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and looked at his wife, who was exhausted and entirely present, and holding a daughter with dark hair and a grip that was already demonstrably not going to let go of anything without a fight. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the two of them. This woman who had climbed a mountain and refused to leave it, and this new person who had arrived on that mountain and would grow up knowing it as home. And he put his hand over Abigail's and couldn't speak for a moment. "Well," Abigail said, looking up at him with her hair loose and her eyes bright, and that particular quality she'd had since the very first day, that absolute refusal to fold. "Say something." "She's going to be exactly like you," he said. "Lord help you," she said and laughed. He kissed her forehead, held her hand, looked at his daughter. Outside, the summer morning was doing what summer mornings on Red Mesa had always done, coming up hard and bright and indifferent to anyone's story. The cattle were moving in the upper pasture. The water was running clean from the north face down through the channel into the tank. The fence lines were holding. The deed to the land was in a drawer in the kitchen, legally confirmed and untouchable, with both their names on it now. The woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a refusal to disappear had built something that could not be taken. Not by drought, not by fraud, not by the long accumulated weight of a world that had told her she was less. She had come to Red Mesa for a chance. She had turned that chance into a life, and on the mountain that had tried to break them both and failed in the house they had repaired board by board and season by season. Abigail Walker held her daughter and her husband held her hand, and the water ran, and the cattle grazed, and the sun came up over the mesa, just like it always had. Only now it came up over something that was entirely and irrevocably theirs. The morning after the town meeting. Abigail woke before dawn and lay still for a moment, listening to the ranch breathe around her, the cattle in the upper pasture, the horses shifting in the barn, the water running in the tank, clear, unblocked, running the way it was supposed to run. She'd been tracking that sound for 3 months, the way you track the breathing of someone sick, listening for the change that meant something was wrong. This morning it sounded different. Not because anything had changed in the water itself, because something had changed in her. She got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Caleb found her there. 20 minutes later, the way he always found her. Not surprised, not asking why she was up before the sun, just pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down and wrapping both hands around the cup she'd already poured for him. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like I've been holding my breath for 3 months and I just now remembered how to exhale." He nodded. He understood that. She could see it in the way some of the tension had gone out of the corners of his eyes, that constant low-grade vigilance that had been living in his face since before she arrived. Probably the permanent readiness of a man who had been fighting a slow war alone for 2 years. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "Marsh said 2 weeks for the marshal, maybe 3. Boone will use that time. He'll try." Caleb set his cup down. "But he's lost the story, like you said. Whatever he does now happens in a room where people already know what he is." His jaw was set, but differently than usual, not bracing against something incoming, but settled, decided. That changes what's possible for him. She looked at him across the table. At the man who had been so certain she would leave that he'd built his whole demeanor around absorbing that inevitability, and who was now sitting in his own kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, drinking coffee she'd made like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because it was. It had become that. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "I'm not leaving." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not relief exactly, because relief implied he'd still been doubting it, and she didn't think he was doubting it anymore. Something quieter. The particular piece of a thing being said out loud that has already been understood in the body for a long time. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it plainly." "I know that too." He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers. "I'm glad you did." The first crack in the waiting came 4 days later, and it didn't come from Boone. It came from Garrett. Hector brought the news from town on a Thursday afternoon, riding hard. Not quite the emergency pace of the fire or the cattle, but fast enough that Abigail was already at the fence line when he came through the gate. "Garrett's talking," Hector said. "To anybody who'll listen. He's been in the saloon since noon." He looked at Caleb, who had come out of the barn. "He's scared. Cole's men have been seen in the territory. I think Garrett knows the warrant's coming, and he's trying to get ahead of it." "What's he saying?" Caleb asked. "Everything." Hector paused. "He's saying Boone gave the orders. All of it, the channel blockages, the feed, the night they cut your pipe. He's naming dates and amounts paid and who carried out what." He looked between them. "He's burning Boone to the ground to save himself." The yard was very quiet. Abigail felt it land not with triumph, but with the specific weight of confirmation. Everything they had documented, every piece of evidence she had gathered and written, and sent every calculation she had made about what Boone was doing, and why, all of it validated by the man who had engineered it. "Does Boone know?" Caleb asked. "Word gets back fast in this town." Hector looked grim. "Yeah, he knows." "Then he'll move tonight," Abigail said. Both men looked at her. "He's out of options. Garrett talking destroys any legal defense he had. The marshal's coming. The town meeting already turned public opinion against him." She looked at Caleb. "If he's going to do something, it's now. Before Cole arrives, and before Garrett's statement becomes official record." Caleb looked at the ranch. At the barn, the fencing, the water tank, the house. At everything that represented 6 years of work and 2 years of fighting. "What's he got left to do?" Hector asked. "He could try to destroy the evidence," Abigail said. "But he knows we've sent copies. That's gone." She thought. "He could try to discredit the witnesses, lean on Louisa or Clara." She met Caleb's eyes. "Or he could try to make the property worthless before any restitution order goes through. If the ranch is destroyed, the land value drops, the legal case gets more complicated." "Fire," Caleb said. The word sat in the air between them like a lit match. "We split up," Abigail said immediately. "Hector, you ride to Louisa's and Clara's boarding house tonight. Stay with them. Don't leave them alone." She looked at Caleb. "We stay here. We watch." "I'm not leaving you here," Hector started. "I'm not alone," she said. "Go." Hector looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded once. "Go, Hector." He went. That night was the longest of Abigail's life on Red Mesa. They didn't sleep. Caleb sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, and Abigail moved between the porch and the barn and the water tank, checking, watching, listening to the night with every nerve she had. The summer dark was thick and hot, and the stars were very bright, and nothing moved on the mesa that shouldn't be moving. 2 hours before dawn, she heard horses. Not one, not two, 3, maybe 4, coming from the east, at a slow walk, the careful, quiet pace of men trying not to be heard. She put her hand on Caleb's arm. He'd already heard. He was already standing. "How many?" she breathed. 4, he said. Same number she'd gotten. They came out of the dark at the east edge of the property, 4 riders, one of them carrying something, and in the starlight, Abigail saw what it was, and her blood went cold. A torch. Not lit yet, but they're ready. Caleb stepped off the porch. "That's far enough," he said. His voice cut through the dark, completely level, no shake in it, nothing that gave them anything to work with. "You're on Walker land and you're being watched. I've got a clear shot on all 4 of you, and I will use it if I have to." The riders stopped. Silence. Then a voice she didn't recognize, not Garrett, not Boone's usual men. Boone says this is his last offer. Take the buyout. Leave the territory. Tonight. Tell Boone, Caleb said, that the federal marshal arrives in 2 days. Tell him that Garrett is already talking, and we have copies of everything in 3 different cities. Tell him. His voice dropped to something even quieter and more final. That this is the last time anyone rides onto this property at night and rides off again without consequences. Are we clear? The silence stretched for a long 10 seconds. Then the rider with the torch turned his horse. The others followed, and the dark swallowed them back up the way it had delivered them. Abigail stood beside Caleb in the yard, and her hands were shaking, and she did not try to hide it. That was, she started. Yeah, he said. They might come back. They won't. He turned to look at her, and his face in the starlight was absolutely certain. That was Boone's last move. He's out of men who'll take that risk now that Garrett's talking. He's out of cover. He paused. It's over, Abigail. Not official yet, but over. She breathed out, long and slow. He put his arm around her shoulders, solid, present, warm, and she leaned into it and let herself be held for a moment in the dark on the porch of the ranch that was theirs, that no one was going to take. I need to sit down, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. They sat on the porch steps together until the sky started going gray in the east, and neither of them spoke much, and it was the best silence she'd ever sat in. Marshal Cole arrived on a Tuesday. He came with 2 deputies and a warrant already signed, and he was exactly what she'd hoped for a man who had seen enough fraud in his career that Boone's particular variety did not surprise him, and who had read every word she'd sent to Tucson and arrived already convinced. He stopped at the ranch first, and when he sat across from Abigail at the kitchen table, that table that had held so many of the hard and real conversations of the last 3 months, he looked at her and said, You put this together well. I had help, she said. Louisa Reyes, Clara Aldridge. He nodded. Good women. Brave women. He looked at the papers. Garrett's statement corroborates everything. We have enough. He stood. We're riding to Boone's property this afternoon. After he left, Caleb stood in the yard and looked east for a long time. Abigail came and stood beside him. You've been waiting for this for 2 years, she said. More than that. He didn't look away from the eastern mesa. 6 years. Since before Boone started pushing. Since before... He stopped. Didn't finish. But she knew what the unfinished sentence was. Since Elena. Since the flood. Since the particular moment when his life had become the long, hard project of surviving his own grief. She slipped her hand into his. He gripped it. It doesn't fix everything, she said. No, he agreed. But it fixes this. He turned to look at her. And this matters. This land matters. The water matters. The people on this mesa who lost what they lost because of him, they matter. He brought her hand up and held it to his chest. And you matter. What you did, what you built and documented and argued and refused to back down from. He shook his head slightly. Abigail, you came up here with a carpet bag. And a very good memory, she said. He laughed. She loved that laugh. Marry me, he said. The same 2 words as before. Simple, direct. Caleb Walker entirely. You already asked me that, she said. I know, I'm asking again. His eyes were clear and gray and entirely certain. I'm going to keep asking until there's a ring on your finger and a preacher has said the words, because I am not under any circumstances giving anyone in Dust Creek the chance to claim this was anything other than permanent and official and completely serious. She looked at him. At the man who had been so sure she would leave that he'd stopped saying things out loud, and who had learned slowly at the pace of hard seasons and small shared moments that she was not going anywhere. Yes, she said. Still yes, obviously still yes. The news of Boone's arrest came back to Red Mesa by sundown. Hector brought it from town riding with the particular energy of someone carrying good news for a change. Boone had been at his desk when Cole arrived apparently. Had looked at the warrant. Had said nothing useful. had asked for his lawyer with the dignity of a man trying to control the terms of his own collapse. Garrett was already in custody, already talking. By the next morning, all of Dust Creek knew, and something shifted in the town. The way things shift in a community when a story they've been telling themselves turns out to have been wrong. Not a dramatic shift. People don't overturn their understanding of the world all at once, even when the evidence demands it. But a visible one. A woman stopped Abigail on the street that week and said her family had lost land to Boone years ago, and asked quietly and directly if there was anything to be done. A man who had watched the first day's laughter without stopping, it came to the ranch and asked if there was work to be done on the fence line and put in 4 hours without asking to be paid. Small things. Real things. Ruth Morrison. When Abigail passed her on the street 2 days after the arrest, stopped and clasped her hands and said, "What you did at that meeting, I've been thinking about it." She paused. "I said things. When you first came. They were unkind and they were wrong, and I want you to know I know that." Abigail looked at her. At the stiffness in her shoulders, and the genuine discomfort in her face, and the effort it had clearly cost a proud woman to form those words. "Thank you, Ruth," she said, quietly. Without triumph, without sarcasm, without any of the things she might have been entitled to put into it. Just the plain acceptance of an honest thing said honestly. Ruth's shoulders dropped half an inch. Caleb, standing a few feet away, said nothing until they were past. Then, "You didn't have to be gracious about that." "I know," Abigail said. "But I meant it." She said the thing. That took something. She glanced at him. "I'm not going to make her sorry she did." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am going to spend the rest of my life being surprised by you." "Good," she said. "You should be." The summer festival came 3 weeks after the arrest. They rode into town together. Caleb and Abigail Hector and Clara Aldridge, who had stayed in Dust Creek longer than she'd planned, and seemed to find reasons to be wherever Hector was, a development that Abigail observed with quiet satisfaction and said nothing about to anyone. The festival had a dancing square at the center of the main street, and by afternoon it was full. Fiddles and the stomp of boots, and the particular released joy of people who had spent the summer under a shadow that had now been lifted. Louisa Reyes was at the edge of the market, standing straight, talking to a woman she knew, carrying nothing heavy in her posture. She caught Abigail's eye and nodded once, the small, real nod of a woman who had put something down and was learning how to stand without the weight of it. Abigail nodded back. Then Caleb appeared at her elbow. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at him. "You don't dance." "No," he said. "But I want to. Here. With you. Right now." He held out his hand, and in the gesture was everything he wasn't saying out loud. "This is the spot. This is the street. These are the same people, and I want to stand in the middle of all of it with you, and let every single person here see exactly what this is." She took his hand. How was exactly as bad a dancer as she'd expected. Half a beat behind the music, and stiff through the shoulders, and at one point he stepped on her foot and said, "Sorry, Lord, sorry," in a way that made her laugh, the real laugh, the unguarded one, the one that came from somewhere she'd spent years protecting. But he didn't let go. He held her hand, and he kept trying. And when the music slowed, he pulled her closer, and they moved together in the simple way of two people who had learned each other through hard seasons, and around them, people danced, and a few watched, and nobody laughed. Harold Briggs, who had bet she'd last 3 days, tipped his hat at her from across the street. She nodded back. When the music paused, Caleb looked down at her in the middle of the dance floor, with his hand still holding hers, and his gray eyes entirely open. No guard in them, no tiredness, no held-back thing, and he said, "You know what today is?" "The festival," she said. "It's been 1 year since you stepped off that stagecoach." She went still. 1 year. She counted it backward in her chest. The laughter of that first day, the cold kitchen, the fire, and the cattle, and the water channel, and the poison in the feed, and the night riders, and the town meeting, and the kitchen table, and the hands almost touching, and the hands actually holding. 1 year of choosing every single day not to fold. She looked at the street, at Louisa, at Hector laughing at something Clara had said. at the town that had once been a place that made her small, and was now a place where a woman stopped her to say thank you, where a man tipped his hat and meant it as one human being to another. "They don't laugh anymore," she said. "No," Caleb said. "They don't." She kissed him. Right there in the center of the street, in the center of the festival, in the center of the life they had built. His arms came around her, and he held her, the way he held everything that mattered, carefully and completely, and she held him back the same way. Someone in the crowd clapped. Hector whistled long and low. Someone said, "About time," and she was nearly certain it was Ruth Morrison, and she decided she liked that. They married in October. The ceremony was at the ranch with 30 people who came because they wanted to, and a preacher from the next town, and the late afternoon light coming down over Red Mesa, the way it came down in autumn gold, and serious, and entirely beautiful. Caleb said his vows in the same voice he used for everything, real quiet and level, and completely without performance. The voice of a man who had decided a thing and was stating it plainly. Abigail said hers the same way, looking at him the whole time, not at the preacher or the crowd, but at him because he was the point. When it was done, Louisa caught her eye and gave her the small, real smile. Clara Aldridge was crying, which made Hector panic briefly, and then reach over and take her hand with the careful deliberateness of a man making a decision, which made Abigail file that away for later with deep satisfaction. The following summer, on a morning in July, Hector rode hard to the north fence where Caleb was working and said, "You need to come." Caleb came. The midwife from Dust Creek was already at the ranch. By the time the sun cleared the mesa, what came from the house was the sound that changes everything. The first cry of someone who had not existed in the world until that precise second, and now did completely and irrevocably. Caleb stood in the doorway of the bedroom and could not speak. Abigail was exhausted and entirely present, and she was holding a daughter with dark hair and eyes that already had that particular quality. Alert, assessing, taking in the room with the focused attention of someone who intends to understand everything around her. He sat beside her, took her hand, looked at the two of them for a long time. "Say something," Abigail said. "She's going to be exactly like you," he said. "Lord help you," she said, and laughed, and the sound of it filled the room the way it always had, real and unguarded and completely hers. He kissed her forehead. He held her hand. Outside, the water was running clean from the north face into the tank. The cattle were moving in the upper pasture, and the deed to the Walker Ranch, both names on it now, legally confirmed and untouchable, was in the kitchen drawer, where they'd put it the day it came back from the land office with the territorial seal. The woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpet bag and a lifted chin, and nothing to prove to anyone except herself, had built something real on the mountain that had tried to break her. A home. A marriage. A life that belonged entirely to her and to the man who had been brave enough finally to stop waiting for her to leave. She had come to Red Mesa for a chance. She had turned it into everything. And that was not the beginning of her story, and it was not the end of it. It was simply the moment when the woman who had refused to disappear looked around at the life she had made and understood completely, and without question, that she had always been exactly enough.